Good evening. I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Scandinavia House this evening for a lecture by Dr. Olav Orheim entitled New Developments in the Arctic. This lecture is presented with the support of the ASF Sønsteby Whist Fund and is dedicated to the memory of Norwegian war hero Gunnar Sønsteby, who was a longtime friend of the Foundation and received the ASF Award in 2001. Gunnar Sønsteby was one of Norway's most honored war heroes. In 1940, Mr. Sønsteby was secretly trained as a resistance fighter in England and subsequently became Chief of Operations of the Norwegian Resistance movement. He was decorated by the governments of Norway, Great Britain, and the United States, and most notably was the first non-American to be awarded the United States Special Operations Command Medal. Mr. Sønsteby's vision was responsible for the establishment of the Museum of the Norwegian Resistance in Oslo, which ensures that future generations will remember the struggle Norwegians fought on their own soil during the time of foreign occupation. The Sønsteby Whist Fund was created by ASF trustee Andrew Whist, who is with us here tonight. We're delighted to welcome him, in honor of Gunnar Sønsteby, whom Andrew considered to be a great friend and a very, very great inspiration. I'm now pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Olav Orheim. It's a great pleasure to welcome him back to the ASF and to Scandinavia House. This is his third visit. He is one of Norway's most eminent climatologists and glaciologists. He has held leadership positions in a wide variety of international polar research organizations and was director of the Norwegian Polar Institute from 1993 to 2005. From 2005 to 2012, he headed the International Polar Year program of the Research Council of Norway. He has also served as Vice President of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, as well as Chair of the Regional Board of International Arctic Science Committee, as well as Chair of the Forum on Arctic Research and Chair of the European Polar Board. In the political arena, he served as Chair of the Committee on Environmental Protection under the Antarctic Treaty and has held several positions with the Antarctic Treaty Meetings of Experts. He has completed more than 30 field seasons of research in the Arctic, and he has authored over 80 research publications covering a wide range of topics, including glacier mass balance and climate, ice dynamics, icebergs, remote sensing, and politics of the polar region. From 1989 to 2005, he was adjunct professor at the University of Bergen, and in 2007, he was knighted under the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav. He is currently chairman of the United Nations Environmental Program at Arendal and also chairman of the Norwegian Glacier Museum and chairman of the Polar Ship Fram Museum. On top of all of this, he is one of the most engaging and enlightening and knowledgeable speakers you'll ever find. So we're very happy to have him with us. Please welcome Dr. Olav Orheim.
Thank you, Ed. I'm not sure if I can live up to all of that, but I will try to live up to some of it and then leave the rest for your imagination. It's only about 2 years ago, slightly less than that I was here, and I talked about changes taking place in the Arctic. It wasn't just that then, but it is actually very nice to be back here and to talk to you. But it's also fascinating that I can today, when I was looking at this, and I looked at the slides and the themes that I talked about 2 years ago, and a large part of that was different from what I would say today. This is a place where the change and the pace of change is faster. In some connections, it's faster than anywhere else on Earth. And I say that without any qualifications. So I'm going to talk about the politics. I'm going to talk about what is the Arctic. I'm going to talk about the drivers. And then I'm going to finish by hopefully giving you some indication why you should worry about the Arctic, even if you don't plan to live there, even if you don't plan to make money up there, even if you think you will continue just to live in New York. The political refocus, of course, started long before today, but it is again a place where the pace has increased in the last few months, in fact. Before 1991, in the period of the Cold War, the Arctic was a place of very little, might say, cooperation, no multinational cooperation at all. There was bilateral cooperation, but the Soviet Union in those days was not willing to open up for any kind of multinational cooperation because they felt they would lose control. And in this, of course, is the situation, as we all know, because we're all old enough to know this, of a period when the nuclear deterrent part was a very important and the most important part in some connections of the security thinking, both of the United States and of the Soviet Union. And for the Soviet Union, they only had one second strike capability. That was the submarines in the Arctic Ocean. The US had two. They had the B-52 bombers in addition. And many, if not all of you, will remember the film with Dr. Strangelove, floating on a bomb down towards the Soviet Union. But the B-52 was there, and the submarines for both countries were there because there was not perhaps a very strong fear, but there was you had to plan for the contingency of being attacked, and that somebody would take out your silos, and that this other side knew where your fixed land silos were. And so you needed a second strike capability that could not be taken out. And for the Russians, that was the most important part of the Arctic Ocean. Therefore, they would not open for any kind of economic development up there, because that meant you could go in and listen in the waters. And they would not, as I say, open for multinational cooperation, because then suddenly they didn't have the control. But at the same time, Russia and US discussed issues, and Norway and Russia had a good cooperative agreements on fishing stocks, for example. So it was not without any cooperation, but it was very small, and it was very stable, very predictable, and any issue was first looked on as a security issue. Now, into the 1990s, many things happen. Of course, in Russia, the Soviet Union disappears. The European Union expands, so to speak, and gets borders with Russia, which actually affects the security situation in Europe in many ways. But in the north, it was pretty much a waiting situation. And then we come into this century, and suddenly things are starting to change, especially in the recent years. Some of them are listening here. Russia, of course, is taking on new roles, not always roles that we think they ought to be doing. Europe and Asia are short on energy, and they're getting a major part of their energy from Russia today. And we have the petroleum prices, which used to be the barrier for the Arctic. That's no longer a barrier, because any international company going there wants to make money. So as long as the price was low, they didn't go there anyway. But now it's been a different situation. Climate change is making part of the Arctic more accessible, and most recently, and only about a year ago or so, we have new actors coming in. So, when did this start? Well, it certainly didn't start in the US until 2007, 6 or 7. Before that, the Arctic was still low on the political agenda. It was homeland security after 2001 that dominated. But towards the end of the last decade, different kinds of approaches came, and especially in the European Union, there were countries outside the Arctic that were saying, okay, but this is a sort of free-for-all area. We should be going in there. And that's a bit what time is reflecting here. In 2007, who owns the Arctic? Well, in reality, the Arctic is already owned. It's already carved up, although they're international waters in the central part of the Arctic Ocean. It is not a free-for-all. Also, the idea of it being accessible is only partly right, as I will come to later on. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people don't get interested or countries don't get interested. You can't just say to a country, well, this is actually not your playing field, because if one big country goes in there, others want to be there. Big countries think in a different way. They think long-term strategically. And in the Arctic Council, which was established in 1996, in the beginning, there were some European observing countries. And then, as you can see here, we got a number of new ones last year. And these were the Asian countries, the big Asian countries coming in: China, India, Japan, Korea, as well as Singapore. Now, why on earth did Singapore come in there? Well, they have said very clearly they are interested to see what's happening with shipping across the Arctic Ocean. That's the only reason they're going in. The other countries kind of different ones. For China, it's certainly a question of natural resources. Korea is a shipbuilding country. Japan is a shipping country, etc. So we are seeing changes. The European Union wanted to become an observer of the Arctic Council last year. And observers, incidentally, don't have any power in the Arctic Council. It's only the 8 countries that are around the Arctic that are the permanent members and make decisions. But yet they want all of these to be in now on what's happening there, to be contributing to the discussions and hopefully in the corridors influencing some of the 8. Well, the European Union was not let in last year. There was a conflict among many things, which I can discuss later if need be, but they were allowed to observe the meetings. So it's quite interesting. The European Union is a fairly powerful player, but at the moment in the Arctic, they are at best, they're not even allowed to talk, but they're allowed to observe and be sitting right in the back at the moment. Well, what's happening in the US? I thought I'd pick up this one, which I actually went and picked up from the net today, because this is on the 20th of October. John Kerry goes out and says the US has a clear agenda for what it wants to achieve politically in the Arctic. And I've jumped right into the politics, because later on when I talk about drivers, you will understand why there's the politics in this. But the US will be taking over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council in half a year. And they are already planning very strongly on what initiatives the US should be taking. Reading between the lines, one can also read that they want to be in on the action if there's resource extraction to be done there, if there are new opportunities, the US want to be a major player, which of course is not at all unusual. US business interests have always been important. I can also note, though, that the special advisor on Arctic affairs, an admiral, has now said, and I quote, that the US shall be more forward-leaning on climate issues, and unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the Arctic isn't confined to the Arctic. We are missing the first H here, but that doesn't matter. There are long-term and short-term changes in the Arctic. When he was asked in the press conference, this is last month, what do you mean about this, what do you know about climate change? And he says, well, I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm a sailor, and I've been up there, and I've seen what's happening. And I will illustrate this now in a moment. So, what is the Arctic? Well, we can define the Arctic in many ways. For many people, we think of the Arctic as the Arctic Circle at 66 degrees going around like that, circumpolar around the North Pole. And we have North America here, we have Europe on this map. But the red line is actually how the Arctic Council defines the Arctic, and that coincides pretty much, although there's a little bit of political boundaries here, it coincides with where the 10-degree temperature, the warmest month of the year, is no warmer than 10 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a temperature definition, not a geographic definition. And if you look at this, you see that means that it goes far south, here at the Bering Strait, for example, down in North America, way down into Canada, whereas in the northern part of Scandinavia, we only have a little bit, which is the part of the Arctic, and then a very large part of Russia, which is also part of the Arctic. Greenland, of course, is part of the Arctic. Svalbard, Iceland is all within the definition here. It contains an area of about 40 million square kilometers. That's about 4 times the contiguous United States. It's home only for 4 million people, though. And it contains 320,000 indigenous people. So this is not a huge population area. If we look at this at night time, we can see how sparsely populated it is. It's actually fascinating to look at the globe at the night. And here's North America, here's the United States, and we have the Canadian amassment at the border of the US. Here is Europe, Norway with its population along the coast, and Russia. But the Arctic which we just looked at, that's all up here. And these are all lights from populated places. Practically nobody lives in the Arctic. So it's not that it's such an interesting place politically because there are many people there, but there are many, many other things there. But it's hard, and I used to live in Tromsø in northern Norway, it's hard to tell people in the Arctic that if it gets warmer, it gets worse. There's no way you can convince them of that, because the reason there's so few people there is, of course, it's very hard to make food up there. And in the old days, when you were living off the land, agriculture and so forth, this was the hardest place on earth to live where there were people. Antarctica is even harder, but there were nobody living there. So getting warmer in the Arctic is not necessarily all bad. But there's not one Arctic. There are several Arctics. It is not just the animals, the polar bear, which we all hear about, and the further away from the Arctic, the more you think the Arctic is only the polar bear. It is not just one type of indigenous people. Some are very happy with what they are. Others are, as in this picture, protesting on what's going on. Altogether, if we look at the Arctic region by region, we see some surprisingly large differences and, in many ways, disturbing differences. And I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not going to talk a great deal about this. But in the northern part of Scandinavia, this difference in standard of living between the indigenous and the non-indigenous living in the same area is almost zero. Then the life expectancy is about the same. It is also not very large differences in Alaska. Also, indigenous earn good money in Alaska. They have a reasonably long life expectancy. In northern Canada, the indigenous have a life expectancy more than 10 years less than the non-indigenous. And also in Russia, there are huge differences in income and in life expectancy. This is related to many things, many problems, alcoholism and so forth, but there are these huge differences. And there are huge differences in natural conditions. Over on this side, and also over in northern North America with Canada specifically, we have permafrost, that is frozen ground, maybe 2,000 feet down into the ground. In northern Norway, we have no permafrost at all. So there are huge differences also in what the nature looks like, even though it's all Arctic. So when people talk about the Arctic, that is actually something we should not talk about. Now, I will get into climate change for a moment, and that is, of course, a very important part of what's happening. But I have one message, that it will affect the environment a great deal. It is not obvious how much it will mean for the economic developments. But the observed changes we have now with the pack ice, the ice that's floating up here on the Arctic Ocean, which is now going back fast, those are the fastest changes of any phenomena on Earth that we are seeing in the Arctic. There are huge changes by any standards. And I'm showing you here an animation where you can see what's happening with the pack ice here for the last decade or so. Where the ice, where it's white, is where we have thick ice. And this is starting in 1987, when we started to have satellite observations from the Arctic. And the blue is young ice, so every summer we get rid of the ice, then it starts again. And in the beginning, up to 1994, we have very little changes. Every winter there's a lot of ice, and even in the late autumn there's still a lot of ice left behind. 1999, 2000, still a lot of ice up here through the year. But as we're getting into the last 10 years or so, we start seeing changes up here. Now we're in 2007 is the first change. Look at these large, how it disappears here in the summer. Again and again we have summers with very little ice up there. That is what's happening here. And of course that's interesting, not just the environmentalists. Their image is this one of the polar bear sitting on a solitary ice floe and disappearing. And the polar bear, unfortunately, will get into living conditions in some parts of the Arctic where that cannot survive in its present way of living. Simply because the polar bear female gives birth in the winter to usually 2 cubs those cubs cannot swim any distances. So when they come out in the spring, in April, and they have to, and they stay with the mother for more than a year, learning to hunt seals, and the only food they find is on the pack ice. So in those parts of the Arctic, and which is perhaps half the Arctic, those polar bears will not find pack ice in the spring, and if they don't find pack ice, they cannot get to the seals because they can. Adults, polar bears can swim long distances, but the youngsters will not make it. But other parts of the Arctic, Canadian Arctic, the polar bears will survive. Now we can like this or dislike it. I personally dislike it. But the idea that they completely will disappear, I think we shall not worry about. There's also the interesting phenomena that polar bears are actually part of the same family as brown bears. And so they can mate with a brown bear. And so maybe in the future we will have some zebra-shaped, etc. Yeah, I don't know. But if you shave that polar bear there, you will see that its coat underneath is dark, almost black. Yeah. But the reduced ice, of course, is giving new opportunities also, and that is one major reason why we see these new nations coming in. Fisheries perhaps, or perhaps not, but shipping, oil and gas, offshore, tourism, etc. Let me I made this point here once before, but I like it, so I'm going to for once repeat myself. This, and because also I'm standing here as a Norwegian, and all of those who have followed Norway will know that once upon a time, 100 years ago or so, we had Fridtjof Nansen, who went with the polar ship from along the coast of Siberia up the New Siberian Islands, and he froze in here, and then he drifted across the Arctic Ocean. That's the red track that is his, and came out here. That took from 1893 until 1896. That drifting, 3 years. On here, I put ice in shaded white as it was in 2007. It's not the minimum, it was even lower a few years later. But if any of the last 7 years, if Nansen had gone up here with from in conditions like they've been in the last 7 years, he would not have found any ice to freeze into. He would have had to go all the way up here, maybe even beyond 85 degrees north, to find any ice to freeze in. And what then would have happened is that he would have come out, because we have put buoys there, we put instruments here today, and they came out again here after less than 1 year. And there's a minimum requirement to become a polar hero in Norway, and that's at least 1 year. So he would not have, maybe that would have changed our history for all that I know. Yeah. So this is what's happening to the minimum situation. This is September, average September conditions. And you see there was not much change. This is up to 1896 or so. A little bit of reduction, and then the speed of reduction has increased. And of course, not every year is less than the previous year. But nobody looking at this can doubt that we are seeing a large change up there. So what's happening then, and where will the ships go? Well, this is the 2007 situation back again. And as you see, this is where the ice was. Here's Greenland, here is North America, here is Alaska, Bering Strait. This is the average situation. So you see the reduction is primarily being on this side and much, much less on the Canadian side and down to Greenland. And that is what we are seeing every year. We're not seeing an even loss of sea ice everywhere. We're seeing it on the Russian side. So the talk is about the new shipping routes. If you're sitting here in Shanghai, or in this case in Japan, and you're sailing from Japan to Rotterdam, it's half the distance to go across the Arctic Ocean from going around. That does not mean that all ships will go there even in the autumn. In fact, as I will demonstrate, it's likely that not many at all will be going for a while. And container shipment is not the kind of shipment that goes and can be changed by one day or another. It's very much delivery exactly on time. But bulk shipment is starting to move now across the Arctic Ocean in the autumn. And there are several options for this, but in reality there's only one for the future which will be very exciting, and which I think will definitely also concern Western shipping. And that's going across one of these two red lines, not necessarily across the North Pole, but going across So they're staying out of Russian territorial waters. The territorial waters here are the yellow system here. But you see, imagine you're coming from Asia and you're going to Europe and you're sitting here in the Bering Strait. Your choice is not to go through the Northwest Passage, even if it's open, because this is shallow water, complicated to go through. Your choice is, of course, the shorter one across here and in deep waters practically all the way. So that's where we will see the large shipment the day this is predictably open for larger lengths of time. That day is not here yet, but it will be coming if the sea ice continues to change the way it is now. This also then allows me to point out that if you look at the Arctic Ocean, most of these are actually, some of them at least, have been now agreed with the submission through the continental shelf system. For example, the Norwegian boundary north of Svalbard is fixed here. Norway and Russia has fixed its demarcation line, goes like this in the Barents Sea. Russia and the United States actually have agreed on the split here up the Bering Strait, but it's not been ratified in the Russian Duma. The biggest conflicts remaining in the Arctic Ocean now are, of all things, between United States and Canada. How do you draw the line out here on the continental shelf? Because United States has not signed the law of the sea. If they did, they would actually get a bigger share of the continental shelf than if they go by the medium line, by the sector line going up to the North Pole. But at the moment, the US has not signed this. And the second big disagreement between USA and Canada is to go through these, what the Canadians call inland waters and what the US consider high seas. That one, the two countries, because they don't plan to go to war over this issue, have decided to be totally in disagreement, and the Canadians allow the American ships to go through without actually stopping them, but they protest and they don't like it. There's some minor disagreement here between Greenland and Canada on a small island here. That's being solved. And finally, there's an interesting disagreement on something called the Lomonosov Ridge, which goes right across here, which both Russia and Greenland, Canada feel that they can look on as a continuation of their own continental shelf. That is not shown here in the yellow or orange lines. Just to finish this on the pack ice, look at this situation. This is the minimum we've had so far. The ice is shown in color here. This is on the 17th of September in 2012. There was open here in the Northwest Passage, but look at the huge amount of open water. And for the first time in 2012, we could sail north of Russian territorial waters all the way. A situation like this is also predictably available then for shipping several months, at least a couple of months into the autumn. This is September, and of course then it starts to freeze. But the freezing on is new young ice, and new young ice is something that shipping is used to. Commercial ships are not able to go in the Arctic Ocean in heavy ice. But young ice is what you see here in the Baltic, in Europe in the Baltic. Here you see it on the Great Lakes in the winter, and the Norwegian Veritas alone has more than 1,000 commercial ships with low ice class that could go up there in thin ice. So there's a lot of shipping available to go in thin ice. So that's not going to stop the process as such. But look at this. Here is the amount of tonnage being shipped along the Russian coast in the 1980s, when there was a lot of military activity, of course. This is 6 million kilograms going here. And here we are down into the 90s. It's dropping away, and it's only now starting, and this year it's up about here. We're still not back to the quantities that were in the 1980s. But in the 1980s, it was all destination cargo going to military bases, mostly along the Russian coast. Now some of it is transshipment, which is a new thing. Large challenges, obvious challenges. something to be sorted out, and where the Arctic Council will be working, International Maritime Organization is working on a polar code, etc. But one of the interesting, and for all of us who are used to conditions up there, we will see new actors coming on board, and maybe not so familiar with conditions, and maybe they need to learn something new up there. Yeah. I'll just, as a short aside, say warmer conditions does not mean everywhere becomes more accessible. In the parts that we don't have permafrost, it's fine, but in the permafrost areas, the summer conditions will get worse, and if the winter roads get worse, that will also affect, for example, on-land economic developments. So it's not a simple situation. The maritime parts, the ports, the shipping will become easier, the winter roads will become worse. And this is not a typical example, but it's a good picture of a winter road in the summer in Siberia. And you can see conditions here. And it's not been developed, and it's hard to develop in the permafrost area because the water doesn't drain in the permafrost area because it's frozen underneath. And so you have many, many areas which are almost inaccessible in the summertime. Now, resources, because that's the other driver up there, is what's happening to resources. And those other countries coming in, many of them think that this is now a new Klondike. Well, maybe. I'm not. Nobody can predict this with certainty. But my take on this is that it's likely to not be as fast as we think, and we are not at all sure that the expectations, or at least I would say that the expectations are quite moderate for what is coming in the near future. First of all, oil and gas. There's no question. The United States Geological Survey 7 years ago, so said 6 years ago, that 22% of the not discovered petroleum is in the Arctic. That's a very interesting way of putting it, because the not discovered simply means it could be zero or it could be something else. But of course it is based on an analysis of what's happening further south, and if you look at this you can recognize it takes a little while, because we have all these colors which are related to prospects of petroleum. So, but if we start looking carefully here, we will find the Bering Strait is right here. So here's Alaska, and you see there's quite high prospects here. And here's the Russian side, and going all the way around. Here's northern Norway with the Barents Sea, Novaya Zemlya here, and here's Greenland. So you can start seeing. And so some areas have high prospects. North of Canada here in the Sverdrup province is high, as I say, north of Alaska, and there's some very large and promising areas on the Russian side, especially here in the Kara Sea and in the Barents Sea. Okay, but nothing or little, not much has been drilled and found yet. And it's quite possible they will be wrong. But if we take this as the truth, then 22% is a huge number if we compare it with some other parts of the world. It's much, much larger than any area of and the total of Asia. If you look at, don't include the Middle East in Asia, it is larger by far than all of South America, and it's larger than all of continental US if we don't look at the cracking and so forth. So in that sense, these are very large numbers, but we are not there where we know how much of this is true. Now, as long as the price of oil was up at $100 or so, it looked like some of the international companies were willing to go a long way to take risk in the Arctic. Shell Petroleum just announced now they want to extend their leases up there and have more time to drill up there. They've spent $6 billion so far looking. Statoil has been involved in nearly 100 exploratory wells in the Barents Sea. Statoil and Total bought themselves into the Stockman field. The biggest American company in the Arctic is ExxonMobil, who are into dialogue and in agreements with Rosneft. All of these are putting money into the expectations that there are large finds to be made. However, if the oil prices drop significantly, you may find oil or gas up there, but still not make money, because the distance to the markets is further, the cost of developing in the Arctic is high. So now many of these companies are being slightly cagey and sitting and waiting a little bit to where they're going. Minerals is another issue. The Greenland thought they would be making a lot of prospects. They've opened up Greenland as recent political developments have given them home rule and control over their resources. And if you look here from 2002 until 2013 here or 12, this is the number of exploration licenses in blue, and then prospecting licenses, but exploitation license, which is what costs money, and when you are actually developing something, that's actually constant through this. So there's a lot of exploration going on, but little development. And that, I think, characterizes perhaps the Arctic more than the idea that there's suddenly a great bonanza. There's been exploration on a very small scale for petroleum around Greenland, and this is one example of a company that has pulled out. This you can see is incidentally is Greenland. You can recognize sort of greenish style in the housing and so forth. The new developments in the Arctic are not going to depend primarily on climate change. It's going to be on the issue of price and on the willingness of the political system in each particular country to open up new areas for exploration and exploitation. And in the case of Russia, of course, it has also to do with the international companies having confidence in that Russia will stick with its agreements, which has not always been the case when it comes to oil and gas, as British Petroleum has experienced. Onshore, the Russians are still exploring, but they're not finding many new fields, and they are very desperate to get going on offshore. This is a small development up in the nets, but you see the contrast between the locals here and a small pipe in the back. This is actually also delivering oil to Europe. But Rosneft wants to go ahead offshore, but if they don't have Western partners, they're going to have a very hard time doing that because of they lack the technology. Oddly enough, we almost hear nothing about mining, and yet mining is big in the Arctic. It's also very localized, but this particular city, for example, is built here purely to mine for diamonds, which is way down here. You can see the road going around here, down into this pipe. So this is one place where they found diamonds. They just keep on going down and down and down. And this is completely built up around, as I say, the whole city is developed to do mining. There are big Western companies in the Russian Arctic doing mining, and we never hear about them. They don't seem to be worried. I don't know what they do to have this assurance, but they're making good money in the Russian Arctic. And as I say, they keep a very low profile on what they do. An interesting sociological phenomena, which is not surprising perhaps, but which environmentalists don't like to see, is the fact that if you look at where we have developments in this is industry of one kind or another, mining mostly, but also oil and gas. These are in the circles here. And then if you will look at population changes, in blue the population is increasing, and in brown it is going back. And if you put these two top of each other, we see that where there's new possibilities of economic developments coming, that's also where the population is staying stable or increasing. There's a direct link between that. The Arctic, unfortunately, is not a place where it's easy to make a living by so-called traditional means, where there's reindeer herding or polar bear hunting. So the locals up there are mostly looking for jobs to come in, and we see this also in Norway. We have a political system where many in southern Norway will say we want to protect more and more of the Arctic, whereas the average voter in North Norway would say we want more jobs up here. And that's a conflict we see all around the Arctic, but at different levels. In Russia, of course, it's not a conflict because this is all decided in Moscow, so they don't ask the locals what they want. Interestingly enough, if you look at the gross national product, we see here in blue are the Arctic part of the Arctic nations, including the US, And you see our increase in gross national product in the sum of all these countries, on the whole, it has been above zero. It was a dip with the economic crisis. But as you can see, the Arctic has been higher. So the Arctic is growing slightly faster, slightly better economy from a lower point, admittedly, than the rest of the Arctic countries. Now, I'm almost at the end, but I will have one more story to tell you. But before that, I'll just very briefly, because I don't have time to get into that, in green here is the productivity of the global oceans. And interestingly enough, we have high productivity in the Arctic Ocean as we know it, not the central part, ice covered, where we know very little, but as you see around here, the green is high productivity, the blue is very, very low productivity. We have very wealthy fisheries around the coast of Norway. It's not obvious that these will be there in the future, because these fisheries and this high productivity is related to the fact that we have here relatively shallow waters, and we have in the spring, when we have enormous sunshine in, we also have a blooming. It's like a garden up there in this situation where we have the ice giving stable waters, and we have all the energy coming in from the sun, and then we have first plant plankton, and then zooplankton, and then fishes eat on that, and then all the way up in the chain, all the way up to seabirds and the polar bear on top of it. If we move into the high Arctic Ocean, if it gets warmer water, so this productivity zone moves northwards into the high Arctic Ocean, we also move into deep waters, and where we don't have the upwelling of the nutrients. And so it's not obvious that if it gets warmer in the Arctic, the sea will become more productive. That's one of the hotly debated issues among scientists. As I said, the Arctic will impact on us, and I'm going to finish with a little story on that one too, and on sea level. One of the impacts is, of course, that the Arctic is by melting snow and ice, the whole globe gets slightly darker, and so we absorb more sunlight, and so we have a feedback effect. We also have a potential and hotly disputed discussion on what happens with the permafrost. When we start melting all this frozen ground, there's also methane in it, and will that then be released and speed up any global warming? Well, that's one of the issues we don't know too much about, and it's of course potentially a tipping point that we don't want to enter into. But I thought I should finish by talking a little bit about sea level, since talking in New York and Sandy, it's appropriate that we talk a little bit about what happens with sea level and go a little bit deeper into that. And what I say about climate change, as you must have figured out by now, is that climate change is a complex story, and the fact that the globe in itself is getting warmer is not bad everywhere. There will be some areas that get it worse and some areas that actually get it better. It's a complex story. But when it comes to sea level, there's only one direction. It will go worse. It will be higher. There's nobody who will be winners when it comes to sea level change. And this picture and many others you will know better than me what happened here almost exactly 2 years ago. A combination, of course, at that time of high tides, winds blowing water ashore, low pressure. It was not sea level change that was doing this. But you can see if we have a sea level change on top of it, it will increase the frequency when we have this combination of all these factors. So what happens now with sea level? Well, we know what causes sea level to change. At any particular spot, of course, the land can be moving up or down. We have storage of water on land. We have things that happens in the ocean, and we have expansion of water when the ocean warms, and we have the exchange with the ice on land. It is this one which is by far the most important. Today, that's the major part of reason why we have sea level change. In the past, when we had glaciers, much more ice on land, it was practically the only reason why we changed sea level. So as we go into a future where we are melting snow and ice, we will also see sea level going up. That's totally unavoidable. And we are measuring now, which we would not before. Before we were only measuring sea level with so-called tide gauges. Now we can measure it from the altimeter, we measure it by gravity, and we measure what happens to the ice. And so we are seeing several independent ways of measuring sea level change, and we are quite confident in what we are measuring. We can argue about the future, but we know what we are measuring. And what we are measuring